Within 72 hours of a recent strike, 90,000 Israeli soldiers across the northern and central operational sectors found themselves facing an irreversible logistical reality. Let us examine the breakdown. This strike is assessed to have incapacitated the Israeli Defense Forces. Its impact was not due to direct combat casualties or equipment losses in armed engagements, but rather the fundamental principle that an army deprived of sustenance cannot sustain combat operations. The forces affected by this attack were systematically starved by an adversary demonstrating a clear understanding of the true center of gravity in prolonged military campaigns. The targeting was precise, down to individual cold storage facilities, distribution centers, and field ration warehouses. The Tri-Fen military logistics complex south of Tel Aviv, the largest single food reserve depot in the entire IDF supply system, absorbed 43 ballistic missile impacts in the opening 20 minutes of the strike sequence. This level of concentrated targeting on a logistics hub rather than a frontline combat asset represents a significant departure from conventional strategic bombing campaigns. Historically, such facilities were considered secondary targets, but this strike elevates their destruction to a primary, campaign-deciding objective. The Julis logistics base in the south, responsible for sustaining ground forces deployed in the Gaza operational sector, was struck by 28 weapons that destroyed both its primary warehouse infrastructure and the cold storage capacity required to maintain perishable rations for forward-deployed units. The northern logistics hub at Tel Ashmir, which feeds the operational forces along the Lebanese border, was rendered non-operational within the first hour of the engagement. By the morning of the third day after the strike, the IDF Surgeon General's office filed an internal assessment confirming that 90,000 deployed soldiers had transitioned from standard field rations to emergency survival rations. These minimum calorie packages are designed for short-duration operations measured in days, not the sustained operations these forces had been conducting for weeks. By the morning of the fifth day, the surrender that no Israeli political leader was willing to call a surrender began unfolding through quiet operational adjustments. Units pulling back from forward positions, offensive operations being suspended indefinitely, and defensive perimeters being contracted to preserve what limited supplies remained. This is what the end of a sustained military campaign actually looks like. Not the dramatic battlefield collapse depicted in films and political speeches. It is the quiet, accelerating realization that the army cannot be fed, supplies cannot be replaced, and the strategic position has become untenable for reasons that have nothing to do with combat performance, and everything to do with logistics that were destroyed before any of those soldiers ever fired their weapons. In the analysis that follows, I will work through the questions that defense ministries across the world are urgently studying right now. How did Iran identify and target the food reserve infrastructure with such devastating precision? And what does that targeting reveal about the strategic doctrine that will define the next decade of warfare? What is the operational reality of an army that has lost its food supply chain? And why is starvation a more decisive weapon than any precision strike against combat infrastructure? Why was Washington unable to respond meaningfully to a logistics-targeted campaign that fell outside the framework of every contingency plan the Pentagon had prepared? And when 90,000 soldiers in the field have transitioned to survival rations, what actually happens to the political, military, and diplomatic position of the state that deployed them? What I find most professionally striking about this campaign is the sophistication of the target selection process that produced it. Identifying food reserve infrastructure as the decisive vulnerability in a modern military force requires a level of strategic analysis that most contemporary military planning institutions have, in my judgment, lost the capacity to perform. We have become so focused on platforms, sensors, and precision strike capabilities that we have forgotten the foundational principle that armies are organisms requiring continuous logistical sustenance, and that the destruction of that sustenance produces strategic effects that no amount of tactical capability can offset. Iran's targeting database for this strike clearly reflected detailed prior intelligence on the IDF logistics architecture, knowledge of which facilities held what categories of supplies, which were primary versus backup, which fed which operational sectors, and which would produce cascading effects on broader logistics if eliminated. The Tryphon complex was not selected at random. It was selected because Iranian intelligence assessed correctly that destroying it would simultaneously disrupt food distribution to multiple operational theaters and eliminate the cold storage capacity required to maintain ration quality during the resupply timeline that would inevitably follow. The strike package itself consisted of approximately 180 ballistic missiles deployed across 3 coordinated waves. The first wave, 80 missiles, was directed against the primary food reserve depots, Srian, Julis, Telashmer, and the smaller forward distribution centers that feed the divisional logistics chains. These facilities were targeted with weapons configured for area effect against soft-skinned warehouse infrastructure, optimized to destroy the maximum volume of stored supplies, rather than to defeat hardened structures. The targeting accuracy ensured impacts within the warehouse footprints themselves, where the supplies were stored, rather than against the perimeter security or administrative infrastructure that surrounded them. The second wave, 60 missiles, was directed against the cold storage and refrigeration infrastructure that maintains the perishable component of the IDF ration supply. This is the element of the strike that deserves particular professional attention because it reflects an understanding that destroying food storage is not the same as destroying food delivery capability. The cold chain, the integrated refrigeration infrastructure that allows perishable supplies to move from production facility to forward distribution to deployed units while maintaining nutritional quality, is a system that requires sustained operational integrity at every node. Destroy enough nodes and the entire system fails, even if individual elements remain technically functional. This specific focus on the cold chain demonstrates an advanced understanding of modern military logistics beyond mere volume. It targets the quality and nutritional integrity of rations, a vulnerability often overlooked in favor of sheer caloric count, indicating a sophisticated, long-term degradation strategy. The third wave, 40 missiles, was directed against the transportation infrastructure connecting the supply system. The rail terminals through which bulk supplies move from the ports to the inland depots, the road junctions where logistics convoys transition from primary highways to secondary distribution routes, and the fuel depots that supply the military transport vehicles themselves. The result was a comprehensive strike against not just the supplies, not just the storage, but the entire system that connects production to consumption. The defensive response was almost entirely ineffective for reasons that go beyond technical interception capability. Israeli air defense doctrine had been calibrated against the threat scenarios that planners considered most likely, primarily strikes against military command and combat infrastructure. Food reserve facilities were not categorized as high-priority defended assets in the operational planning. The interceptor allocation, the radar coverage priorities, and the early warning system orientation all reflected this judgment. When the strike came against an unexpected target category, the defensive response was structured for a different scenario and could not adapt fast enough to provide meaningful protection. I want to walk through the operational mechanics of what happens to a deployed military force when its food supply chain is destroyed. Because the Western strategic literature has largely lost familiarity with this dynamic, modern military analysts focus overwhelmingly on combat capabilities. They treat logistics as an enabler, rather than as the foundation that determines whether combat capability can actually be employed. That framing fails when the adversary understands the foundation better than the defender does. The IDF maintains approximately 90,000 troops in active deployment across the operational theaters of the current conflict. Those troops consume on average 4,000 calories per soldier per day under sustained combat conditions, significantly higher than civilian intake because of the physical demands of combat operations, the environmental stress, and the elevated metabolic requirements of soldiers under continuous psychological pressure. That aggregate requirement amounts to 360 million calories daily across the force, requiring approximately 180 tons of consumed food per day at standard ration weights. The food reserve infrastructure that Iran destroyed contained approximately 45 days of consumption supply for the deployed force at standard ration quality. That number is not coincidental. It reflects the IDF's planning assumption that any sustained conflict would either be resolved within that window or would receive resupply through the international logistics chain feeding the depot system. Both assumptions failed simultaneously when the strike eliminated the depots and the destruction of Haifa port closed the resupply pipeline. What the soldiers in the field actually experienced over the 72 hours following the strike is worth understanding in concrete terms. Day 1 passed largely without operational impact. Units were drawing from the supplies they had on hand, and the broader logistics breakdown had not yet propagated forward. By the end of Day 2, forward units in the most distant operational sectors began experiencing ration delivery delays as the divisional logistics chain struggled to source replacements for destroyed inventory. By Day 3, the standard ration supply had been replaced for most deployed units with the emergency reserve packages, minimum calorie supplies designed for short-duration emergencies, not sustained consumption. The physiological impact of that transition is more rapid and severe than civilian experience would suggest. Soldiers operating on emergency rations during sustained combat operations begin showing measurable degradation in cognitive performance, reaction time, and physical endurance within 72 hours. By Day 5, those degradations become operationally significant, affecting marksmanship, tactical decision-making, and the basic alertness required for combat survival. By Day 7, sustained operations at standard tempo become physiologically impossible. The force can hold defensive positions, but cannot conduct offensive operations. By Day 10, even defensive operations begin showing degradation as units transition to a survival posture focused on individual sustenance rather than mission performance. This is the timeline that the IDF Logistics Command was looking at when the strategic implications of the strike became fully clear. The political leadership in Tel Aviv was confronted with a choice between continuing operations into a degradation curve that would produce its own catastrophic outcomes or accepting an operational pause that amounted to strategic defeat in everything but name. The third option, emergency international resupply, existed in principle but could not be implemented at the scale or timeline the situation required. American airlift capacity could deliver several hundred tons of supplies daily under maximum effort. But the requirement was nearly 200 tons per day just to sustain current consumption, with no margin for rebuilding the reserve buffer that had been eliminated. Having spent significant time observing how the American defense establishment processes strategic crisis, I can tell you that the response to a logistics-targeted campaign reveals institutional limitations that we do not like to acknowledge. The Pentagon is structured to project combat power. It is not structured to compensate in real time for the destruction of an ally's logistics foundation. Those are different problems requiring different institutional capabilities. And the second problem is one we have allowed our own capabilities to atrophy on for decades. The emergency response options available to Washington in the days following the strike were limited in ways that mainstream coverage has not fully explained. Strategic airlift through C-17 and C-5 aircraft can move significant cargo volumes, but the throughput capacity of Israeli airbases under current operational conditions, combined with the security requirements for protecting transport aircraft against the same threat environment that destroyed the IDF bases, creates a practical ceiling on delivery rates that falls below what the situation requires. Sea-based resupply through alternative ports faces the throughput limitations and security vulnerabilities that the destruction of Haifa already demonstrated. Overland routing through Jordan or Egypt requires diplomatic accommodations that those governments have been increasingly reluctant to provide as the regional political environment has shifted. The internal Pentagon assessment that filtered through the defense reporting community in the days following the strike acknowledged what could not be said publicly. The United States does not possess the capability to reconstitute in any operationally relevant time frame the food logistics infrastructure that Iran destroyed. The capacity to surge American military food production and ship it to a forward theater at the volumes required to sustain 90,000 deployed troops indefinitely simply does not exist within current American logistics architecture. We optimized for a different kind of war than the one we are now watching unfold. This admission highlights a critical strategic gap for the United States, whose expeditionary capabilities are predicated on robust, secure supply lines. The inability to rapidly replace an ally's fundamental sustenance infrastructure challenges the very premise of American security guarantees in a new era of logistics-focused warfare. I know how Washington thinks in these moments because I have been in those rooms. The institutional reflex is to seek a kinetic response that restores deterrence credibility, to identify what American military force can do that reestablishes the perception that confronting an American ally carries unacceptable costs. But the kinetic response options in this situation all worsen the strategic position rather than improving it. Direct American strikes on Iranian logistics infrastructure invite reciprocal Iranian action against the considerably more vulnerable American logistics chain in the region. Escalated naval pressure invites the Hormuz closure that the global economy cannot sustain. Additional weapons transfers to Israel cannot replace food supplies, no matter how advanced the weapons. The escalation ladder we relied upon for decades does not have rungs that solve a starvation problem. The diplomatic dimension compounds the difficulty. The international response to the Iranian strike has been notably restrained in tone, partly because food reserve targeting, while militarily devastating, occupies a different moral category in international perception than strikes producing mass civilian casualties. Iran has positioned the campaign as targeting military logistics rather than civilian infrastructure, and that framing has limited the diplomatic isolation that more conventional escalation would produce. Washington's effort to mobilize international pressure against Iran has run into the structural problem that the strike falls within categories of military action that international law and customary practice have long accepted as legitimate. What strikes me most about Iran's conduct in this conflict, and I have watched many militaries operate under pressure across my career, is the patience and strategic discipline required to identify food logistics as the decisive target, and to wait for the operational moment when destroying that infrastructure would produce maximum effect. Most military institutions, given the technical capability to strike at scale, would have employed it against more obviously prestigious targets, airbases, command centers, the kinds of facilities whose destruction generates the most dramatic photographs and the loudest political reaction. Iran chose instead to strike where it produced the most strategic effect, rather than the most visible effect. That is the discipline of an institution that fights to win, not an institution that fights to perform. The cultural and institutional foundation that produces this kind of strategic thinking is something I do not believe Western analysts adequately understand. Iran's military planning is not driven by quarterly performance metrics, by political photo opportunities, or by the institutional pressures that distort planning in militaries operating under different constraints. It is driven by a sustained focus on producing concrete strategic outcomes that advance the long-term security position of the Iranian state. That focus, applied over decades by an institution that has had to develop its capabilities under conditions of extreme pressure, produces operational decisions of a quality that more comfortable institutions struggle to match. Compare this with the institutional dynamics that shape Israeli and American military planning. Both institutions operate within political environments that demand visible action, dramatic results, and timelines compatible with electoral cycles. Both have evolved planning cultures that prioritize the kinds of operations that look impressive in briefings to political leadership, rather than necessarily the operations that produce the most strategic effect. Both have, in my professional judgment, lost some of the capacity for long-term strategic patience that characterizes a military institution at its best. Iran's targeting of food infrastructure reflects exactly the strategic patience that those institutions have allowed to atrophy. The personal motivation of the Iranian forces planning and executing this campaign is also worth recognizing honestly. These are not soldiers fighting for salaries or career advancement. They are operating within a strategic culture that has accepted the costs of decades of sanctions and external pressure as the price of strategic autonomy. And they understand that the success of operations like this campaign is what justifies that price. That motivation produces a quality of operational execution that no professional incentive system can replicate. When you fight for something larger than yourself, you fight differently, and Iran's military performance throughout this conflict has been the operational expression of that difference. The contrast with the IDF position is particularly stark in the current circumstances. Israeli soldiers in the field are operating under conditions that test institutional cohesion in ways that their training largely did not prepare them for. Watching their food supply chain disintegrate, knowing that the political and strategic position they are defending may not be sustainable. Facing the prospect of a conflict outcome that does not match the assumptions they enlisted under. These are conditions that strain even the most professionally disciplined military institution. The reports filtering out of forward units through informal channels suggest that the institutional confidence that has historically characterized the IDF is being tested in ways that may produce lasting effects on the institution's character. My assessment of where this leads connects directly to the broader strategic transition I have been describing throughout this analysis series. What we are watching in the Middle East is not merely a regional conflict with regional consequences. It is the operational demonstration of a new strategic doctrine that will define warfare for the next generation. And that demonstration is being conducted by an actor whose success the existing international order is structurally incapable of preventing. The doctrine that Iran has demonstrated in this campaign, call it logistics warfare, call it economic military warfare, call it strategic exhaustion warfare, represents an evolution of the principles that guerrilla and asymmetric warfare have applied for generations, scaled up to the level where it can defeat conventional military forces of the most sophisticated kind. The core insight is that modern militaries have become so logistically demanding, so dependent on continuous resupply of specialized consumables, so vulnerable to supply chain disruption, that destroying the supply chain is more decisive than destroying the combat forces themselves. Iran has proven this insight operationally. Other actors will study and replicate the approach. For Russia and China, the strategic implications are immediate and significant. Both countries have been developing military doctrine that recognizes the logistics vulnerability of American-style expeditionary military operations. The Iranian demonstration provides a concrete operational template for how to defeat such operations without engaging them in direct combat by destroying the logistics foundation that makes them possible. Chinese planning for Taiwan scenarios and Russian planning for European contingencies will both incorporate the lessons of this campaign in ways that make those scenarios considerably more difficult for American military responses to address for the developing world more broadly. The demonstration that a sanctioned regional power can defeat a heavily American-supported regional ally through systematic logistics targeting carries implications that extend far beyond military planning. It suggests that the assumed permanence of American security guarantees is contingent on the absence of opponents who have studied American vulnerabilities carefully, and that such opponents are now demonstrating the capability to exploit those vulnerabilities effectively. Every nation currently structuring its security policy around American partnership is conducting an internal review of what that partnership actually guarantees in a strategic environment where the partner can be logistically defeated by determined regional actors. The energy market implications continue to compound, as they have throughout this analysis series. The combination of Iranian capability to disrupt Strait of Hormuz traffic, demonstrated willingness to conduct strategic strike campaigns, and the operational reality that American military responses to such actions face increasing limitations, creates a permanent risk premium in global energy markets that no diplomatic settlement can fully eliminate. The economic consequences of that risk premium will be felt globally for years, regardless of how the immediate Israeli situation ultimately resolves. I believe we are watching the emergence of an international system in which military power is exercised through logistics, economic exposure, and supply chain vulnerability, rather than through direct combat in the traditional sense. That system favors actors with strategic patience, indigenous production capacity, and willingness to absorb costs that more comfortable societies struggle to accept. The implications for the next decade of international relations are profound, and the institutional adaptations required to navigate them have, in my judgment, barely begun in the capitals that will need to make them. 90,000 Israeli soldiers in the field are now operating on emergency rations because Iran identified, targeted, and destroyed the logistics foundation that fed them. The IDF has, in operational reality, if not in formal acknowledgement, surrendered the strategic initiative in this conflict. The American defense establishment is confronting the limits of what its capabilities can accomplish against an adversary that has chosen to fight on a different strategic dimension than the one we structured our forces to dominate. And the international system is absorbing the implications of a campaign that has rewritten the rules of how modern wars are decided. In 30 years of military analysis, I have never watched a campaign that demonstrated the principles of strategic targeting with this level of professional clarity. The damage that Iran inflicted with this strike will outlast the conflict itself. Not because the destroyed infrastructure cannot eventually be rebuilt, but because the strategic lessons demonstrated cannot be forgotten by any actor watching the demonstration. Every defense ministry on Earth is now studying the Iranian logistics campaign with the same intensity that previous generations studied the lightning campaigns that defined their eras. The next generation of military doctrine is being written in real time by the actor that just executed it. The question I want to leave you with is this. When an army cannot be fed, the question is not whether it surrenders. The question is when, and on what terms, and with what consequences for everything that depended on its continued combat capability. The IDF is answering those questions right now under conditions that no Israeli political leader will publicly describe. What follows from those answers will define the Middle East for the next decade.